Chapter 6. There was a brief impression of brilliant blue tentacles before the choking sensation began. Ooh, hang on, I want my coffee. Okay, we're back. Choking sensation. Let's get back to that. Ooh. So choking sensation began, right? Okay, that's where. He had the unexpected good sense to yank the drawstring shut again before any more could escape. Then there was just the suckers and the flailing and the suckers and the snapping beak and the suckers. That was a lot of suckers. But there was, in fact, a lot of suckers. The tentacles wrapped around his neck and across his face, and all of them were covered in suckers. He heard a gasping, wailing noise. He tried to pry a tentacle away from his throat and hoped someone would make the noise stop. Oh, wait, that was him. He pulled the tentacle free, which promptly wrapped itself around his wrist. Another one had worked itself under his collar and was probing his back hopefully for mollusks or whatever it was the demon squid ate. There was a tentacle tip in his ear. His ear! Immolated valets or not, no one deserved tentacles in the ear. Sirico, to his credit, tried to help by grabbing a handful of the tentacle wriggling down his spine, while the two goblin guards capered anxiously around in front. One took a swing with his halberd, smacking Gav in the face with the flat of the blade. Fortunately, it also smacked the tentacle, which reflexively let go of his throat. Gav sucked in a sweet breath, which allowed him to howl as Sirico pried his tentacle loose, taking a chunk of collar and what felt like a handful of back hair with it. The tentacle the goblin had dislodged wrapped itself around the halberd. Another draped across his face, still poking at his ear. But with his airflow restored, his brain started to work again. He managed to choke out a spell and touched the side of the tentacle clinging to his beard. It was supposed to shock it into releasing him. Instead, the tentacle exploded. For a moment, all he could hear was a ringing in his ears. He had closed his eyes. He didn't dare open them. He could feel the ichor gluing his eyelashes shut. But the horrible sucking sensation had ceased. He had to get the residue off his face. He needed to see if a second attack was coming. He grabbed blindly at the hem of his tunic and mopped it across his face. He blinked his eyes, fighting the sting. The squid clung with its remaining arms to the top of the halberd, shuddering. The goblin at the bottom of the halberd had frozen, afraid to attract its attention. Sirico stared at him in shock, ichor dripping down his chin. The bag inched its way hopefully across the floor, colliding with a wall. It stopped for a moment and then started to wriggle along down the hallway. Gav gritted his teeth. He swept up the bag and then grabbed a buckler from the other goblin and smacked the squid hard with it. It fell, stunned, to the floor. He opened the mouth of the bag and slammed it on top of the unconscious. Unconscious. Squid gathered it into the opening by feel and yanked the string shut again. He tied a knot in the top and considered, and then he tied another knot. The bag wiggled with dismay or glee. He didn't know if the other squid in there was welcoming his compatriot back or eating it. He didn't much care. He shoved the bag into Sirico's arms. Study. Not another word. Significantly cleaner, Garebeetle jumped yet again when he slammed the door of his chamber open. The valet openly stared. "I don't want to hear it. Bath. Now," snarled Gav. He caught himself in the mirror. His entire face and throat were covered in sucker marks, as if someone had the bright idea of crossing a succubus and a kraken, and he had had the bright idea of making out with it. Some kind of horrible love bites. His hair dripped slime. The proud flames of his tunic had been doused in blue goo. Fearsome wizard, indeed. The goo came off, but no amount of soaking would make the sucker marks disappear. Court ladies probably had cosmetics of some kind for this sort of thing. Valvina would know, he was willing to bet. I think that's supposed to be said a different way, her name, but it's going to be Valvina. That's how I keep saying it. Valevna, that's I think how it's supposed to be. We'll see if I make a shift or not. But that would require calling Valevna and looking like this, and he would almost prefer to open the squid bag again. Almost. There might even have been some kind of squid unguent in his study. Maybe he'd kept it next to the jar of eyebrows. That seemed like a Garavak style. But no, he'd completely wrecked his study multiple times even. He stood in front of his mirror, playing with his cuffs and surveying the damage. He hoped that his initial impression of his face had been colored by rage and frustration. As he had calmed down in the rapidly cooling bath water, he had nearly convinced himself that it hadn't been that bad and that he'd been catastrophizing. But no, it really did look that bad. His life was a flaming disaster, and he had just been attacked by a demon squid. Should he have known better? Clearly, everyone who tried to be a decent human being didn't immediately have their lives collapse, since some people seemed to be capable of maintaining virtue for years upon end. Maybe it was just him. He wasn't competent at good or evil or anything at all. Or maybe once you'd gone evil, reformation was just off the table. On the other hand, he didn't actually feel like torturing Terwin, like Serico and the goblins and Terwin herself had clearly expected him to do. He was completely failing to live up to, say, Zarakonar's example. Zarakonar reveled in other people's pain. So, was the universe punishing him for being evil and humiliating Fiari, or for not being evil enough and letting him go? Or maybe sometimes a moat squid is just a moat squid. He was wasting time waffling. He needed to get some kind of control back. And that needed to start with his workshop. And for that, he needed help. Gerbeetle? He asked. My lord? The valet froze over the ichor-streaked tunic. Are you... He took a closer look. Are you crying? No, my lord, Gerbeetle sniffled. Gerbeetle, why are you crying? He felt a flash of irritation and did his best to quash it. Why was his first impulse always anger? Gerbeetle struggled visibly for a moment and then flung himself at Gav's feet, sobbing. I'm sorry, my lord, I'm sorry. Whoa there, Gav said, completely ill-equipped for this situation. What are you sorry for? For the squid? For the tunic? Everything, the little goblin wailed. Curiously, terror seemed to have overcome his shyness, making him a lot easier to understand. Please don't incinerate me. I'm not going to incinerate you, Gav said. What did one say to a sobbing minion? He tried to pull the little fellow to his feet, but it was like lifting an uncooperative cat. Distress had dissolved his bones, and he just flopped. Gav settled for patting his back in a manner that was probably not terribly comforting. I asked you for the squid. It's not your fault if I can't manage my own cephalopods. I can't, Gerbeetle hiccuped. You can't? Gav was slightly concerned that what the goblin couldn't do was stop crying, or possibly even breathe. Should he slap him? Throw water in his face? All the potential remedies he could think of for hysterics seemed likely to convince his valet that Gav really was going to kill him. I can't get the stain out, Gerbeetle finally managed to choke out. I wailed, but whatever. Throw it out, Gav suggested. Gerbeetle looked appalled. It doesn't fit anyway, Gav said. Throw it out, or give it to the scullery maids to use for rags, or see if Orla's niece or whoever is making the aprons can salvage it for something. I don't care about the tunic. Really? Garabeetle looked up, awed. It was the first time he'd met his eyes, Gav realized. We've both had a hard day, Gav said. Why don't you go on down the hall to the kitchens and tell Orla that I said you needed... He was going to say a cookie, but he realized he had no idea what chosen comfort food of young goblins was. Something to cheer you up, he settled on. You can come back and finish cleaning up once dinner's started. Garabeetle looked completely disbelieving, but he obeyed. Gav watched him scurry off, feeling rather odd. His anger had run out, and so had a little of the self-loathing. Like there had only been room for so much emotion in his body, and worrying about someone else had forced some of it out. It was an unfamiliar mood, one that lingered even as he headed towards dinner. Alicia had beaten him to the great hall for once, for which he was not grateful. She did not turn when he entered, so it wasn't until he took his own seat that she got a good look at his face. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened. The bad mood immediately flooded back. He glared at her hard enough that the candles nearly melted. She shut her mouth with a snap and tried to look nonchalant about the whole thing. He felt a wave of shame, and then immediately another wave of anger. How dare she make him feel ashamed? They both knew what she looked like under all that glamour. All right, she was a princess, but she wasn't a very good one. She had no right to look down on him. And yet, the thought of the knife, and how her face had glowed when she threatened to burn the spell. He didn't care what she really looked like. He wanted her approval anyway. It was pathetic. He took a larger gulp of the wine than was strictly necessary. He thought about the kind of day he had had. He took another gulp of wine. It had started so well, too. Was there even a point in trying to salvage anything? He couldn't manage to sustain 10 minutes of goodwill before his thoughts turned ugly, no matter how hard he tried. He wanted to rest his forehead on the table for a moment. But no, appearances must be kept. That, at least, he'd managed to learn today. Surely he could aim for a more suave form of evil, at least. If only he had the energy. Maybe that was how he initially stumbled down the path to tasteless darkness. It was all one could manage when one's dungeons were inhabited by face-eating cephalopods. No, he could do better than this. He didn't have to give in to Garavax's old habits, or at least he didn't have to show them to other people. If it was all about controlling other people's impressions of him, he could choose a different impression to aim for, regardless of what was going on inside. He summoned his last reserves of stamina, a racing messenger within sight of his destination. Okay. He would manage a civil conversation if it killed him. So, how terrible were the books? He would never see a look of naked adoration on her face. He could at least keep the pleasure of startling her, if he could never see it. Okay, we got this. Every time she gave him that confused look, he felt a flash of satisfaction that she had thought she had figured him out and failed. She measured him over her goblet, clearly weighing how truthful to be. She'd intended to lie, one way or another, he guessed, but she hadn't expected the open invitation to complain. Would she stick to the flattering lie, or play the spoiled princess card? "Have you actually read them?" she finally asked. How should he know? The pieces I needed seemed accurate enough. I don't think anyone needs to know that much about the care and feeding and reproduction of bats, she said dryly. He was saved from needing to respond by the appearance of goblins bearing dinner. We need to get to a stopping spot soon, so I'm running out of time. Well, maybe this is where we stop. He was saved, and so was I, by the appearance of goblins bearing dinner, and there we go.